The mysterious delivery. In the dim glow of the Nebula Wayfarer Tavern, a remote establishment nestled on the edge of a galactic trade route, humanity and alienkind converged in a colorful mosaic of cultures. The air was heavy with the hum of quiet conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional laughter of travelers who had ventured to the fringes of known space. Holograms of exotic dishes and distant star systems flickered in the background, casting an ethereal light on the bar's polished metal surfaces. Matthew Decker, a rugged spacefarer clad in a worn leather jacket that bore the marks of countless interstellar adventures, leaned casually against the bar. His eyes, sharp and observant, scanned the lively room as though searching for something to anchor him in the chaos. For years, Matthew had roamed the far reaches of the galaxy, carrying out odd jobs for mercenaries, diplomats, and traders. His life was one of solitude, punctuated by brief encounters with civilizations so alien they defied description. But tonight, something felt different. There was an unshakable tension in the air, like the static charge before a storm. Matthew couldn't pinpoint the source, but it prickled at the edges of his awareness. He caught the bartender's attention, a wiry alien with 4 arms, deep green skin, and a voice as smooth as velvet. "Something new," Matthew said, his voice carrying a blend of curiosity and challenge. "Surprise me." The bartender's multifaceted eyes glinted with amusement as they began preparing an exotic cocktail. While waiting, Matthew allowed his gaze to wander again. Around him, humans and aliens mingled freely, a testament to how far the galaxy had come in fostering cooperation across species. Yet, for all the camaraderie, Matthew still felt like an outsider, a relic of an older, grittier time. The bartender slid a steaming dish toward him moments later, its aroma unfamiliar but enticing. "Fresh meat," the bartender said with a grin that exposed rows of sharp teeth. Matthew raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Fresh meat. Not something I'd expect out here." The bartender chuckled, their laugh resonating like wind chimes in a breeze. "It's rare, yes. Delivered just this morning. Special order." Matthew picked up a fork and took a tentative bite. The flavor was rich, layered with spices he couldn't identify. It was good, better than he had expected. But just as he was about to compliment the chef, the tavern door hissed open with a soft pneumatic sound, and the room fell silent. All eyes turned to the entrance. Framed by the doorway, a figure stepped into the room. She was unlike anything Matthew had ever seen. Her silvery hair cascaded like a waterfall of starlight, catching and refracting the dim illumination of the tavern. Her skin was a canvas of iridescent patterns that shifted subtly with each movement, like living constellations etched onto her form. Large, luminous eyes dominated her face, their depths holding a mix of defiance and vulnerability. The alien girl's presence was magnetic, and even the most hardened patrons couldn't look away. 2 burly attendants flanked her, their expressions stern as they guided her forward. It was clear she was no ordinary guest. Matthew's heart pounded as their gazes met across the room. In that fleeting moment, something unspoken passed between them, a connection that defied logic or reason. The bartender leaned closer to Matthew, lowering their voice. "She's the delivery." Matthew's fork clattered onto his plate. "What do you mean, the delivery?" "Exactly what it sounds like," the bartender replied, their tone nonchalant but laced with intrigue. "Special order. Came with the shipment this morning." Matthew stared at the girl as she was led to a secluded corner of the tavern. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why was she here? The girl's defiance was palpable, even as the attendants gestured for her to sit. She complied but maintained an air of quiet strength, her gaze sweeping the room like a queen surveying her court. Unable to resist the pull of his curiosity, Matthew stood and approached the table. The attendants stiffened as he drew near, their postures signaling a readiness to intervene. "Easy," Matthew said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I just want to talk." The girl looked up at him, her luminous eyes studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she could see past the facade of his rugged exterior and into the depths of his soul. "Who are you?" Matthew asked, his voice softer than he intended. The girl hesitated, her gaze flickering to the attendants before returning to him. "My name is Kalara," she said, her voice melodic yet tinged with a faint accent that hinted at her alien origins. "And why are you here?" Kalara's expression hardened. "I was taken." The simplicity of her statement carried a weight that hit Matthew like a physical blow. Taken. The word echoed in his mind, conjuring images of forced captivity and exploitation. He glanced at the attendants, their stony faces revealing nothing. Taken by who? Kalara's lips pressed into a thin line, and she didn't answer. Matthew straightened, his mind working furiously. Whoever had brought her here wasn't going to let her go easily. But something about the situation didn't sit right with him. This wasn't just another delivery of exotic goods or rare spices. Kalara was a person, not cargo. As the tension in the room thickened, Matthew made a decision. He wasn't sure if it was his sense of justice, his curiosity, or the unspoken connection he'd felt when their eyes met. But one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away from this. "Let me buy her," Matthew said suddenly, his voice steady and firm. The attendants exchanged glances, their surprise evident. "You can't afford her," one of them said, their tone dripping with disdain. Matthew smirked, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Try me." For a moment, silence hung in the air, the tension crackling like an electric charge. Then one of the attendants stepped forward, looming over Matthew with an intimidating presence. "You really want to do this?" they asked. Matthew didn't waver. "I do." Kalara's eyes widened, a flicker of hope breaking through her stoic exterior. And in that moment, Matthew knew there was no turning back. Whatever the cost, he was about to embark on a journey that would change both their lives forever. A deal in the shadows. The air in the tavern grew dense with tension. Conversations had ceased entirely, leaving the sound of Matthew's voice hanging in the room like a challenge. All eyes were on him. The lone human daring to make an offer for something, or someone, far more valuable than he seemed to understand. The taller of the two attendants leaned closer, his imposing bulk casting a shadow over Matthew. His voice was low and menacing. "You don't know what you're asking for, human." Matthew, unfazed, squared his shoulders. "No, but I know when something's wrong. And this." He gestured toward Kalara, who remained seated but watched him with quiet intensity. "This feels very wrong." The second attendant, a broad-shouldered figure with reptilian features and scales glistening like oil, crossed their arms and sneered. "Do you have any idea who owns her? She's not for sale. She's already spoken for." Matthew's gut twisted at the word owns, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. He had encountered enough corrupt individuals in his time to know they didn't respond to outrage or morality. They responded to leverage. "What if I can offer you something better?" Matthew asked, his tone calm but deliberate. The taller attendant barked a laugh. "Better than the syndicate's price. You must have a death wish." The syndicate. The name alone sent a shiver down Matthew's spine. They were infamous across the galaxy, a shadowy network that dealt in smuggling, trafficking, and everything in between. Crossing them wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. But Matthew's resolve didn't falter. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only the attendants could hear. "The syndicate doesn't need to know, does it? I give you enough credits to make it worth your while, and she walks out of here with me. No questions asked." The reptilian attendant hissed softly, their forked tongue flicking in irritation. "You're either very brave or very stupid, human." "Maybe both," Matthew said with a faint smirk. The taller attendant glanced at their companion, a silent exchange passing between them. Finally, the taller one spoke, his tone laced with warning. "Fine. Let's see if you can put your money where your mouth is. 10 million credits. Up front." A collective gasp rippled through the tavern. Even in the farthest reaches of space, 10 million credits was an astronomical sum. Matthew's expression didn't betray the panic rising in his chest. He didn't have 10 million credits, or even a fraction of that. But he knew hesitation would ruin everything. He leaned back slightly, adopting an air of confidence. "You think I carry that kind of money on me? Give me 24 hours to pull the funds together." The attendants exchanged another glance, their skepticism evident. Finally, the reptilian one sneered. "You have until this time tomorrow. If you don't show up with the money." They trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air. Matthew nodded, then looked at Kaylara. "I'll be back for you," he said softly. For the first time, her stoic mask cracked. A flicker of emotion, hope, gratitude, and something he couldn't quite place, flashed in her luminous eyes. As Matthew turned to leave, the weight of the room's collective gaze followed him. He could feel the unspoken judgment, the whispered questions, but he pushed it all aside. His focus was on the ticking clock and the impossible task ahead. Outside the tavern, the cool night air of the barren planet stung his skin. The twin moons cast a pale, eerie glow over the rocky landscape, and the distant hum of starship engines echoed through the quiet. Matthew pulled his jacket tighter around him and made his way to the docks, where his ship, the Solace, waited. The Solace was no beauty. A battered freighter with mismatched panels and a cockpit that barely held together, it was a far cry from the sleek vessels that roamed the trade routes. But it had one thing going for it. It was fast, and its hidden compartments made it invaluable for smuggling. Matthew climbed aboard, the familiar hum of the ship's systems coming to life as he powered it up. He sank into the pilot's chair, running a hand through his unkempt hair. 10 million credits, he muttered to himself. What the hell were you thinking? His onboard AI, a snarky program named Nova, chimed in. Clearly, you weren't. Do you even have a plan, or are we winging it as usual? Matthew sighed. I need a way to get that money. Fast. Nova's voice carried a hint of amusement. Well, unless you've been hiding a treasure map somewhere, your options are limited. You could always rob a syndicate vault, if you're feeling particularly suicidal. Matthew's eyes narrowed. What if I'm not joking? Nova hesitated. You are joking. Right. Pull up the nearest syndicate outpost, Matthew said, ignoring the AI's incredulity. The holo display flickered to life, showing a map of the sector. A red marker highlighted a nearby moon, known as Verac 7, infamous for its syndicate stronghold. Let me get this straight, Nova said. You're planning to steal 10 million credits from the most dangerous criminal organization in the galaxy, all to save someone you just met. Matthew's jaw tightened. It's not just about her. It's about doing what's right. Ah, the classic Decker moral compass, Nova quipped. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you when this blows up in your face. Matthew stood and began gathering his gear. He strapped a plasma pistol to his side and slung a compact rifle over his shoulder. Years of running jobs for unsavory clients had given him a certain expertise in infiltration, but this would be his most dangerous mission yet. Before leaving the ship, he paused and looked at the holo display. Kaylara's face lingered in his mind. Her defiance, her vulnerability. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her than met the eye. I'll be back, he said to Nova. You better be, the eye replied. Otherwise, I'll sell this hunk of junk to pay off your debts. With a grim smile, Matthew stepped off the Solace and into the night. The syndicate's stronghold awaited, and with it, the chance to secure Kaylara's freedom, or die trying. Inside the tavern, Kaylara sat in silence, her hands folded neatly on the table. The attendants had resumed their watchful positions nearby, but she paid them no mind. Her thoughts were elsewhere, replaying the moment when Matthew had stood up for her. She had seen many things in her life. Acts of cruelty, indifference, and selfishness, but rarely had she encountered someone willing to risk everything for a stranger. It was a dangerous kind of hope, one that she had learned to guard against. And yet she couldn't help but wonder, could Matthew Decker truly be different? As the hours passed, Kaylera's gaze drifted to the tavern's entrance. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that freedom might not be as impossible as it seemed. The reckless heist. The Syndicate's stronghold on Verac 7 was an imposing fortress of steel and concrete, carved into the jagged cliffs of a desolate moon. From a distance, it looked like a monstrous insect clinging to the side of the cliff, its glowing turrets and patrolling drones serving as the sharp pincers that kept intruders at bay. It was a place where few dared to tread, and even fewer lived to tell the tale. Matthew stood on the edge of a rocky ridge overlooking the fortress. A cold wind whipped at his jacket as he studied the layout through his binoculars. The stronghold's defenses were formidable. Automated gun turrets lined the perimeter, and energy shields shimmered faintly around the main structure. The patrol patterns of Syndicate guards were erratic, designed to confuse anyone foolish enough to try and sneak in. "Nova, you better have some good news," Matthew muttered, lowering the binoculars. The AI's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Define good. I've mapped out the defenses, and let me just say, your chances of getting in undetected are slim to none." "Encouraging as always," Matthew replied dryly. Nova continued, undeterred. "However, I did find a weak point. There's a supply tunnel on the east side of the fortress, used for transporting goods. It's less guarded than the main entrance, but you'll still have to deal with security drones and biometric locks." Matthew frowned. "Biometric locks? Great. Any way to bypass them?" "Well," Nova said, dragging out the word, "you could always borrow the credentials of a Syndicate guard. You know, if you don't mind a little close-quarters combat." Matthew sighed. "Fine. Mark the nearest patrol for me." A small red dot appeared on the heads-up display in his goggles, indicating the location of a lone guard patrolling the outskirts of the fortress. Matthew took a deep breath, adjusted his rifle, and began descending the ridge. The Syndicate guard was a hulking brute of a man, his face obscured by a sleek black helmet that connected to his body armor. He paced the perimeter with a plasma rifle slung casually over his shoulder, his posture relaxed but alert. Matthew crept closer, keeping low to the ground. The rocky terrain provided some cover, but one wrong move could alert the guard or the surveillance drones overhead. When he was close enough, Matthew sprang into action. He lunged forward, grabbing the guard from behind and clamping a hand over his mouth. The guard struggled, but Matthew's years of experience in hand-to-hand combat gave him the upper hand. With a swift strike to the base of the neck, the guard slumped unconscious. Matthew quickly stripped the guard of his ID badge and biometric gloves, then dragged him behind a boulder to keep him out of sight. As he slipped on the gloves, Nova chimed in. "Impressive. I'd rate that a solid 8 out of 10 on the stealth scale." "Not now, Nova," Matthew muttered. The supply tunnel was just as Nova had described. A narrow passage carved into the rock, leading to a reinforced steel door. A pair of security drones hovered nearby, their sensors scanning the area. Matthew crouched behind a rock, watching the drones' movements. Timing was everything. He waited until the drones turned their backs, then sprinted to the door. He pressed the stolen ID badge against the scanner and held his breath as the system processed it. With a soft beep, the door slid open. "Nice work," Nova said. "Now comes the hard part." Matthew slipped inside, the door hissing shut behind him. The tunnel was dimly lit, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling and the faint hum of machinery filling the air. He moved quickly but cautiously, keeping his rifle at the ready. As he rounded a corner, he came face to face with the security camera. Without hesitation, he raised his rifle and fired, the energy bolt shattering the lens. "Subtle," Nova remarked. "They know someone's here now," Matthew said grimly. The tunnel eventually opened into a massive storage room filled with crates and containers stamped with the Syndicate's insignia. Matthew's heart raced as he scanned the room for any sign of the vault. "Nova, where's the money?" "Patience, Matthew. It's in the central vault, 2 levels down. I'm sending you the layup now." A holographic map appeared on Matthew's display, highlighting the quickest route to the vault. It involved navigating through a labyrinth of corridors and avoiding, or neutralizing, any guards along the way. Matthew pressed forward, his movements swift and calculated. He encountered several guards, each engagement a tense dance of strategy and skill. Every second counted, and every noise risked bringing more Syndicate operatives down on him. When he finally reached the vault, his breath caught in his throat. The door was an imposing slab of reinforced metal, adorned with glowing blue runes that pulsed faintly. It was a mix of advanced technology and ancient alien design, something Matthew had never seen before. "Nova, tell me you can crack this." "I can try, but it'll take time," the eye replied. "Time is something we don't have," Matthew muttered, glancing over his shoulder. As Nova worked on bypassing the lock, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. Matthew's grip on his rifle tightened. The first guard rounded the corner, and Matthew fired, the energy bolt striking the guard square in the chest. But more followed, too many for him to handle alone. He ducked behind a crate, firing sporadically to keep them at bay. "Nova, how's that lock coming?" "Almost there." A burst of plasma fire grazed the edge of the crate, and Matthew winced as the heat seared his skin. He knew he couldn't hold them off much longer. Finally, with a triumphant beep, the vault door slid open. "Go, go, go," Nova urged. Matthew dove inside, slamming the door shut behind him. He activated the manual lock, buying himself precious moments. The vault was a treasure trove of wealth, credits, rare gems, and artifacts from across the galaxy. But Matthew's eyes were fixed on the glowing containers in the center of the room, each one holding neatly stacked rows of credit chips. He worked quickly, loading as many chips as he could into his bag. The weight was immense, but he didn't care. He had what he came for. Just as he was about to leave, the door behind him exploded inward, sending shards of metal flying. Syndicate guards poured into the room, their weapons trained on him. Matthew raised his hand slowly, his mind racing. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he wasn't about to give up. "Any last words, human?" One of the guards sneered. Matthew smirked. "Yeah, catch." He tossed a small device onto the floor, a makeshift EMP grenade he had cobbled together earlier. The device emitted a high-pitched whine before detonating, sending a wave of energy rippling through the room. The guards' weapons and armor shorted out, sparks flying as their systems overloaded. Matthew seized the opportunity, grabbing his bag and making a break for it. He sprinted through the corridors, alarms blaring and red lights flashing. Nova guided him through the chaos, directing him to the nearest exit. When he finally burst out into the open air, he didn't stop running. His ship, the Solace, was waiting for him on the ridge, its engines powered up and ready to go. Matthew scrambled aboard, throwing the bag of credits onto the floor and collapsing into the pilot's seat. "Punch it, Nova." The ship's engines roared to life, and the Solace shot into the sky, leaving the Syndicate stronghold behind. As the moon's surface dwindled in the rearview display, Matthew let out a shaky laugh. He had done it. Against all odds, he had pulled off the heist. But as the adrenaline began to fade, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was only the beginning. The Syndicate wouldn't take this lightly, and Kailura's freedom was far from guaranteed. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of triumph. 10 million credits, he said, glancing at the bag. "Let's hope she's worth it." Into the lion's den. The adrenaline of the heist still pulsed through Matthew as he piloted the Solace away from Verax 7. The moon's harsh, cratered landscape gave way to the endless expanse of stars. But he couldn't relax. Not yet. Nova's voice cut through the silence, her usual dry tone laced with urgency. "Well, congratulations, Matthew. You're officially the most wanted man in Syndicate space. They've put a price on your head big enough to fund a small planetary war." Matthew smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Guess that means I made an impression. You could call it that. I'd call it suicidal. Their bounty hunters are already mobilizing, and we're still carrying their money. Where exactly do you plan to go?" He tapped a few keys on the console, bringing up a star map. A small planet on the outer rim of the sector blinked into focus. Kalura's prison world, Astra Prime. "We're going to Astra Prime," he said firmly. Nova paused for a moment. "You're kidding. Astra Prime is a fortress planet. Maximum security. Even if you had an army, and you don't, it would still be impossible to get her out of there." Matthew leaned back in his seat, the weight of the credits in the cargo hold heavy on his mind. "I don't need an army. I've got something better. Leverage." Astra Prime was a hellscape of jagged mountains and dense, swirling clouds of toxic gas. The planet's surface was a barren wasteland, but deep underground lay the Syndicate's most impenetrable prison. The facility was a marvel of engineering, designed to hold the galaxy's most dangerous criminals, and those the Syndicate wanted to disappear forever. As the Solace approached Astra Prime, Nova's voice came through the comms. "I've hacked into their orbital defense grid. You've got a narrow window to slip past their scanners, but if you deviate even slightly—" "I know," Matthew interrupted. "Just guide me in." The ship's hull shuddered as it entered the planet's atmosphere. Matthew gripped the controls tightly, his eyes fixed on the swirling storm clouds outside the cockpit. The turbulence was brutal, tossing the ship around like a toy, but he kept it steady, following Nova's precise instructions. When the ship finally broke through the clouds, Matthew got his first glimpse of the prison. A massive, dome-shaped structure embedded in the side of a mountain. Its surface was studded with anti-aircraft turrets and energy shield generators, and squads of Syndicate enforcers patrolled the perimeter. "Looks cozy," Matthew muttered. "Cozy if you're a masochist," Nova quipped. "I've identified an access point on the south side of the facility. It's a maintenance hatch used for venting excess heat from the reactor core. It's lightly guarded, but you'll need to move fast before their next patrol cycle." Matthew set the ship down in a rocky canyon a few kilometers from the facility. He donned a sleek, black infiltration suit equipped with a built-in cloaking device, then grabbed his rifle and a compact satchel filled with explosives and hacking tools. "Nova, keep the ship running. I'll need a quick exit when this is over." "Understood." And Matthew, "Yeah. Don't die." He smirked, wasn't planning on it. The maintenance hatch was exactly where Nova had said it would be. A small circular door nestled in a rocky outcropping at the base of the mountain. A single guard stood watch, his posture relaxed as he leaned against the wall, tapping away on a handheld device. Matthew activated his cloaking device, the suit's advanced nanotechnology rendering him nearly invisible. He crept forward, each step deliberate and silent. When he was close enough, he struck, disabling the guard with a swift, precise blow to the neck. With the guard unconscious, Matthew turned his attention to the hatch. He pulled out a small hacking device and attached it to the control panel. Nova's voice came through his earpiece. "This is a standard Syndicate lock. Shouldn't take more than—" The hatch hissed open. 5 seconds. Impressive. Matthew slipped inside, the hatch closing behind him. The air was stiflingly hot, the walls of the maintenance tunnel lined with glowing pipes that radiated heat. He moved quickly, consulting the holographic map Nova had uploaded to his goggles. "The reactor core is 2 levels down," Nova said. "Once you're there, you can overload the system to disable the facility's energy shields and internal security. But be careful, the core is heavily monitored, and any tampering will trigger an immediate lockdown." "Got it," Matthew replied. The reactor core was a massive chamber bathed in an eerie blue light. At its center stood a towering column of pulsating energy, surrounded by a maze of catwalks and control consoles. Syndicate technicians moved about the room, their attention focused on monitoring the reactor's output. Matthew crouched in the shadows, surveying the scene. He needed to get to the central control console, but it was in the middle of the room, exposed on all sides. "Nova, I need a distraction," he whispered. "Say no more." A moment later, one of the consoles near the far wall began to spark and smoke. The technicians rushed over, shouting commands and attempting to contain the apparent malfunction. Matthew seized the opportunity, darting across the catwalks and reaching the central console. He attached a second hacking device and began uploading a virus Nova had prepared. The process was agonizingly slow, each second stretching into an eternity. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest as he kept an eye on the technicians. Come on," he muttered. Finally, the virus finished uploading. The reactor's energy output began to spike, alarms blaring as the system spiraled out of control. "Matthew, you've got about 2 minutes before this place goes into full lockdown," Nova warned. He didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted out of the reactor chamber, the facility's lights flickering as the overloaded systems began to fail. The prison block was a labyrinth of cells, each one housing a prisoner deemed too dangerous or too inconvenient for the syndicate to release. Matthew navigated the corridors, his goggles scanning for Kalara's biosignature. When he finally found her cell, his breath caught. Kalara looked gaunt but defiant, her piercing green eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Took you long enough," she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Matthew grinned. "Good to see you too. Let's get out of here." He attached a small explosive charge to the cell's lock, shielding Kalara as it detonated. The door swung open and she stepped out, her movements confident despite her weakened state. "Do you have a plan?" she asked. "Of course," Matthew said. "We run." The two of them raced through the facility, alarms blaring and guards flooding the corridors. Matthew handed Kalara the pistol, and she proved more than capable of holding her own, taking down several guards with precision shots. When they finally burst out of the maintenance hatch, the toxic wind stung their faces. The Solace was waiting for them, its engines roaring to life. "Get in," Matthew shouted. They scrambled aboard, and Matthew wasted no time, launching the ship into the sky. As they broke through the planet's atmosphere, Kalara collapsed into a seat, laughing breathlessly. "You're insane, you know that." Matthew grinned. "Yeah, but it worked, didn't it?" For the first time in months, Kalara felt a flicker of hope. They were free. For now. But the Syndicate wouldn't let this slide, and they both knew the fight was far from over. As the stars stretched out before them, Matthew tightened his grip on the controls, ready for whatever came next. The Syndicate strikes back. The euphoria of escaping Astra Prime didn't last long. The Solace hadn't traveled more than a few light years when Nova's warning systems lit up like a supernova. "Matthew, we've got incoming," her voice crackled over the comms. Matthew's grip tightened on the controls. "How bad?" "Let's see. 3 Syndicate assault cruisers, 5 fighter wings, and oh, look, a bounty hunter frigate. I'd say it's a party. They've triangulated our position and are closing fast." Kalara, seated in the co-pilot's chair, glanced at the holographic radar display. "They're throwing everything at us. That's not just a retrieval squad. That's a kill team." Matthew's jaw clenched. He had expected retaliation, but not this fast, and certainly not this intense. "Nova, plot us a course to the nearest jump point." "Already on it, but there's a problem. The cruisers are setting up an interdiction field. If they activate it, we won't be able to jump to hyperspace." Kalara leaned forward. "Then we take out the field generator before they can deploy it." Matthew shot her a sideways glance. "You do realize the generator is probably on one of those cruisers, right? As in, the massive, heavily armed ones that want us dead." Her green eyes flashed with determination. "You got me out of that prison. The least I can do is help keep us alive. Do you have any stealth torpedoes on board? Matthew grinned despite the dire situation. You really haven't lost your edge, have you? Nova, arm the stealth torpedoes and target the generator. On it, Nova replied. But be warned, once we fire, they'll know exactly where we are. The space around the Solace erupted in a dazzling display of energy beams and missiles as the Syndicate fleet closed in. Matthew weaved through the chaos, his piloting skills pushed to their limits. Firing stealth torpedoes, Nova announced. On the radar, 2 small blips shot toward the nearest cruiser. The torpedoes were nearly undetectable, but as they closed in, the cruiser's shields flared to life. Impact in 3, 2, Nova counted down. The torpedoes struck the generator pod mounted on the cruiser's hull, detonating in a brilliant explosion. The interdiction field flickered and then collapsed. We've got a window, Nova shouted. Matthew punched the throttle, the Solace rocketing toward the jump point. But just as they reached the edge of the system, the bounty hunter frigate appeared, cutting them off. The frigate was an imposing sight. Its hull painted a matte black that absorbed light, making it appear as a void in space. Its captain's voice crackled over the comms. Freighter Solace, this is Captain Darrow Venn of the Eclipse. Surrender now, and I'll make sure your deaths are quick. Resist, and I'll take my time. Kalara scoffed. Charming. Matthew switched on the comms, his tone dripping with defiance. Sorry, Captain Venn, but I'm not in the mood to die today. Maybe another time. Venn chuckled darkly. Suit yourself. You won't get far. The frigate's weapons powered up, unleashing a barrage of plasma cannons. Matthew rolled the Solace to the side, narrowly avoiding the first volley. This ship isn't built for combat, he shouted. Kalara smirked. Good thing I am. She sprinted to the rear of the ship, where the Solace's single turret was located. Climbing into the gunner's seat, she activated the turret's targeting system. Let's see how they like this, she muttered, opening fire. The turret's energy blasts peppered the frigate's shields, drawing its attention away from the Solace's main engines. Inside the cockpit, Matthew and Nova worked frantically to outmaneuver the frigate. Nova, divert all power to the rear shields, Matthew ordered. That'll leave the front vulnerable, Nova warned. If we don't make it to the jump point, it won't matter, Matthew shot back. The frigate's cannons fired again, one of the shots grazing the Solace's hull. The ship shook violently, warning alarms blaring. We're not going to last much longer, Kalara shouted over the comms. Matthew gritted his teeth. Hold on. He pulled the ship into a steep climb, using a nearby asteroid field for cover. The frigate followed, its larger size making it difficult to navigate the dense cluster of rocks. Matthew, I've got an idea, Nova said suddenly. There's a dormant asteroid mining station near the jump point. If we can leave the frigate there, we might be able to use its old defense systems against them. Matthew's eyes lit up. Do it. The abandoned mining station loomed ahead, its massive structure partially collapsed but still functional. Matthew guided the Solace through the wreckage, the frigate hot on their tail. Nova, activate the station's defenses, Matthew ordered. On it, Nova replied. A moment later, the station's automated turrets roared to life, targeting the frigate. The frigate's shields absorbed the first few hits, but the constant barrage from the turrets began to wear them down. Kalara, focus fire on their engines, Matthew shouted. Way ahead of you, she replied, unleashing a precise volley that struck the frigate's rear thrusters. The frigate's engines sputtered, and it began to lose speed. With the frigate disabled, Matthew didn't waste any time. He guided the Solace to the jump point, the ship's engines straining under the pressure. Jumping to hyperspace in 3, 2, 1, Nova announced. The stars blurred into streaks of light as the Solace entered hyperspace, leaving the Syndicate fleet and the bounty hunters behind. In the aftermath, the tension in the cockpit finally eased. Kalara returned to the co-pilot's chair, a triumphant grin on her face. "You really know how to make an escape dramatic," she said. Matthew chuckled, though his expression remained serious. "We're not out of this yet. The syndicate won't stop hunting us." Kaylura's gaze softened. "Then we'll keep fighting. Together." As the hyperspace tunnel stretched before them, Matthew allowed himself a moment of hope. They had survived another battle, but the war with the syndicate was far from over. A beacon of resistance. The hyperspace tunnel stretched endlessly before them, a swirling cascade of blues and whites. Inside the Solace, the hum of the engines was the only sound as Matthew slumped back in his chair, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. Kaylura leaned back in the co-pilot's seat, wiping soot from her face. "So, what's the plan now?" she asked, breaking the silence. Matthew stared ahead, his brow furrowed. "The syndicate's going to come after us harder than ever. We need more than just running. We need allies." Kaylura tilted her head, intrigued. "Allies? In case you haven't noticed, people don't exactly line up to take on the syndicate." Matthew glanced at her, his eyes glinting with determination. "Maybe not, but what we have, what you know, can change that. The syndicate's been hiding in the shadows for too long. People don't fight because they think it's hopeless. What if we give them hope?" Kaylura's expression softened, her mind racing. "You're talking about exposing them." "Exactly," Matthew said. "You were their top scientist. You've seen their operations, their vulnerabilities. We don't just run. We use what you know to take them down from the inside." As the Solace exited hyperspace, they arrived in a desolate sector of space littered with the remains of ancient battles, hulking derelict ships floating aimlessly. Nova's voice broke the silence. "Welcome to the graveyard," she said. Kaylura raised an eyebrow. "The graveyard." Matthew nodded. "An old battlefield from the Orient conflict. Nobody comes here anymore. Too many ghosts. But there's one ship still active, a rogue faction that's been hiding out here for years." Kaylura frowned. "You trust them?" "I don't trust anyone," Matthew replied. "But they hate the syndicate as much as we do. If anyone's crazy enough to help us, it's them." The rogue faction's ship, the Resolute, was a massive dreadnought covered in battle scars. As the Solace approached, Matthew sent out a signal. "This is Matthew Kane, captain of the Solace, requesting permission to dock." There was a long pause before a gruff voice responded. "Kane." As in the Matthew Kane, the smuggler who stole from the syndicate. Matthew grinned. "That's me. I've got something you'll want to see." Another pause, then, "Docking Bay 3. But if you try anything, we'll blast you out of the sky." Kaylura smirked. Friendly. Inside the Resolute, the air was thick with tension. Armed guards escorted Matthew and Kaylura through dimly lit corridors to a war room where a group of grizzled leaders waited. At the head of the table stood Commander Tarek, a towering man with a cybernetic arm, his piercing gaze fixed on Matthew. "You've got guts coming here, Kane," Tarek said. "What makes you think we won't hand you over to the syndicate for the bounty on your head?" Matthew held up his hands. "Because I got something better than credits. I've got their secrets." He motioned to Kaylura, who stepped forward, her presence commanding. "This is Dr. Kaylura Vin," Matthew said. "She was the syndicate's lead scientist. She's seen things that can turn the tide against them." Kaylura stepped closer to the table, meeting Tarek's skeptical gaze. "The syndicate isn't invincible. Their tech, their operations, they all have flaws. I can show you how to exploit them." The room buzzed with murmurs. Tarek raised a hand, silencing them. "If you're lying, it'll cost you more than your lives," he said. Kaylura's voice was steady. "I'm not lying. But this isn't just about taking down the syndicate. It's about giving people a chance to fight back." Over the next few hours, Kaylura laid out everything she knew. The syndicate's black sites, their supply chains, the weaknesses in their fleet. The rogue faction's leaders listened intently, their skepticism slowly giving way to resolve. Commander Tarek leaned back in his chair, his cybernetic fingers drumming on the table. If what you're saying is true, this could be the beginning of something big. But we can't do it alone. Matthew nodded. We're not asking you to. There are others out there. Colonies, resistance cells, people who've suffered under the Syndicate. If we can unite them, we can turn this into a real fight. Tarek's lips curled into a grim smile. You're talking about a rebellion. Call it whatever you want, Matthew said. But it's time the Syndicate learned they can't control the galaxy forever. The next few days were a blur of activity. The Solace became a hub for encrypted transmissions as they reached out to potential allies. Nova worked tirelessly, using her AI capabilities to track down resistance groups and bypass Syndicate surveillance. Kalara spent hours with the rogue faction's engineers, helping them upgrade their weapons and defenses with the knowledge she had stolen from the Syndicate. Matthew, meanwhile, focused on rallying support. He recorded messages that were broadcast across the galaxy, calling on anyone willing to stand up against tyranny. People of the galaxy, he said in one message, his voice filled with conviction. For too long, the Syndicate has ruled with fear and oppression. But they are not invincible. Together, we can fight back. Together, we can take back our freedom. The Syndicate, of course, wasn't idle. Their propaganda machines churned out lies, painting Matthew and Kalara as dangerous criminals. Bounties were raised, and new hunting parties were sent out. But despite the risks, the messages spread. Small victories began to add up. A Syndicate convoy ambushed here, a black site liberated there. The rebellion was gaining momentum. One night, as Matthew stood on the observation deck of the Resolute, staring out at the stars, Kalara joined him. You really think we can pull this off? She asked quietly. Matthew turned to her, his expression serious but hopeful. I don't know, but I know we have to try. For every colony they've crushed, every life they've destroyed, we owe it to them to fight. Kalara nodded, her resolve hardening. Then let's make them regret underestimating us. As the two of them stood side by side, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, as if the galaxy itself was rooting for them. The rebellion had begun, and while the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. Matthew Kane and Kalara Vin had sparked a fire that the Syndicate would struggle to extinguish, and in the vastness of space, where hope was often a fleeting thing, their defiance became a beacon, drawing the oppressed and the brave to their cause. The fight for freedom was far from over, but it had never burned brighter.